When he was a kid, the older boy spoke of an urban legend. Out in the desert, a company had buried its own death, entombed it in concrete, and then denied it. No grave marker, no record, just a line of trucks driving into the night, and a slab of concrete poured over whatever was down there. For 30 years, no one could prove it. Not where it was, not how much was buried, because the company that did it said it never happened. The kids who believed it called it the grave. 30 years later, that kid, now a grown man, heard that someone was heading into the desert with an excavator. So he drove out to the middle of nowhere to watch. And he wasn't alone. 200 strangers stood in the desert heat, ringed around a hole in the ground, waiting. The backhoe dug down through 30 years of dirt until it scraped concrete. Then it broke through. And what it found was a mass grave of inventory a company had paid more than $20 million to make, and then paid all over again to bury.
Jerry, video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too.
1 billion games are played every month.
Addictive. It is. Because you sit there and you just want to play it more and more.
The game is one of survival. Eat or be eaten.
In 5 years, Atari's video game sales had gone from $200 million to $2 billion.
We are here on the very side of one of the biggest video gaming mysteries of all time.
In 1976, Warner Communications bought Atari for $28 million, more than $150 million in today's money. 4 years earlier, Atari had been two men, a few $100s, and an idea. Its co-founder Nolan Bushnell had a game called Pong, 2 paddles and a bouncing dot. Pong wasn't the first video game. A console called the Magnavox Odyssey beat it there, and a judge would later say so in court. But Pong was the first one everybody actually played. It dragged the video game out of the lab and turned it into a quarter-eating sensation. First in a California bar, then every arcade in the country, then millions of living rooms across North America. Atari hadn't invented video games. It had figured out how to sell them. By 1976, Bushnell needed money to build his next machine, and Warner's chief, Steve Ross, had it. Ross was a deal maker who'd built an empire on one instinct, that the right name at the right moment could sell almost anything. He didn't see a company that made a small box. He saw the leading edge of an industry with no ceiling. 5 years earlier, that box had not existed in a single home on Earth. Now children sat in front of it, feeling like they were living in the future, and that feeling was the asset. The games themselves almost didn't matter. The promise sold itself, and the promise was simple. The new thing is the future, and the future only gets bigger. So Warner ran Atari like a promise. To keep costs down, it handed the company to Ray Kassar, a man who had spent 25 years at the largest textile company in the world. Kassar had a specific view of the designers of the games. They weren't artists. They were labor. He called them prima donnas. He was about to be proven spectacularly wrong. In 1979, 4 of Atari's programmers, out of a staff of 35, realized their games made up 60% of everything the company sold. One of them, David Crane, had built games that earned Atari more than $20 million. His salary was $20,000. They asked to be treated like musicians, their names on the box, a cut of what they made. Atari said no, so they left. In 1979, 4 programmers walking out looked like nothing, a rounding error against a company whose sales were still climbing toward $2 billion. But the studio those 4 would soon build was Activision, and 4 decades later, Microsoft would pay $69 billion for it, the biggest acquisition in gaming history. In letting those 4 walk, Atari had decided something about itself, that the talent behind the games mattered less than the marketing in front of them, that novelty could outsell quality. And a company that treats its product as incidental will, sooner or later, get exactly the product it believes in. In 1979, Atari wasn't really a company. It was a promise that you could own the future, and everything that came after was that promise being tested. For a while, the promise paid like nothing in American business ever had. By 1980, the Atari 2600 sat in 10 million living rooms, and the games it ran were no longer toys, they were events. Atari licensed Space Invaders that year, the first arcade smash to land on the 2600. Sales of the console doubled. People bought a 2600 just to play it. Pac-Man fever spilled out of the arcades and into lunchboxes, top 40 records, and Saturday morning cartoons. By 1982, Atari was the fastest-growing company the United States had ever seen. Its sales had climbed from $75 million to over $2 billion in 5 years. The line had only ever gone up, and everyone made the only assumption that line allowed, that it always would. This was the dream at full height, and it is worth feeling it the way they felt it. Not nostalgia, belief. The conviction that you are living at the start of something, that the thing in your hands is a piece of the future, and that getting in now means getting in early. It is one of the best feelings a human being can buy. Atari was selling it by the millions, and it was real every time. Then, in March of 1982, Atari released the home version of Pac-Man for the 2600. Convinced every household in America would want a copy, and to spare, it manufactured 12 million cartridges. There were roughly 10 million 2600s in existence to play them on. More games than there were consoles. It read as swagger. The smart money was sure. Wave it away. 3 months later, a movie called E.T. the Extraterrestrial swallowed the summer, and Steve Ross found the purest expression of his own theory. Warner paid Universal more than $20 million for the rights to turn it into a game, an unheard-of sum, on a bet that the name alone would carry it. His own CEO, Ray Kassar, called the idea dumb. It didn't matter. The name was the product. The name would sell. To get it on shelves by Christmas, the programmer assigned to build it, Howard Scott Warshaw, was given 5 weeks. The industry standard was 6 months. You cannot sell 12 million cartridges to a market of 10. You cannot build a game in 5 weeks. But that math only matters once the line stops climbing. And the line had never stopped climbing. Christmas morning, 1982. Across America, children tore the paper off the most wanted game of the year, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, slid it into the 2600, and watched the future they'd been promised drop them into a well they couldn't climb out of. The most anticipated thing of the season was broken. It had taken Howard Scott Warshaw 5 weeks to build, and it came back. Of the 4 million copies Atari had manufactured, the number it needed to sell just to break even on the license, only about 1.5 million found buyers. Then 669,000 customers brought theirs back to the store. The rest never moved off the shelf at all. By Ray Kassar's own count, 3.5 million cartridges came back to the company, by the truckload, by the warehouse, stacked to the ceiling. Every warning they had waved away had not been a warning. It had been the story, told early, to anyone willing to hear it. E.T. was not the wound. It was the evidence. Here's the part that wasn't really about a bad game. By the time E.T. shipped, the shelves were already drowning. Atari's success had taught everyone the same lesson Ross had taught, that newness sold itself. And after Atari's lawsuit to block Activision collapsed in 1982, anyone could publish games for the 2600, and many did. In the 6 months leading up to December 1982, the number of games on the market more than quadrupled. Quaker Oats opened a video game division. So did Purina, the dog food company. Companies that had never made a game in their lives were shipping cartridges, all of it going out under the same promise of the future. And that did something no single failure could have done. When everything is new, new stops being information. A shopper standing in front of a wall of unfamiliar cartridges had no way left to tell the good from the garbage, because its new had described all of it, right up until it described nothing. The signal that had built the entire industry went dead, drowned in its own supply. So buyers did the only rational thing left. They stopped trusting any of it, and they stopped buying all of it. A market worth $3.25 billion in 1983 was worth around $100 million by 1985. Not a decline, a near total erasure. 97% of the medium an entire culture had called the future, gone in 2 years. People didn't fall out of love with one company. They lost the ability to believe the promise. And once that was gone, there was nothing underneath it to hold. The dream hadn't been a lie. That was the worst part. It had been true, briefly, completely. And then a dog food company started making games about it, and the truth wore off. The promise turned back into a balance sheet faster than anyone could move. On December 7th, 1982, Atari, a company who controlled 80% of the video game market and roughly 2/3 of Warner Communications' profits, admitted its growth would come in at 15% over the next year, not the 50% it had been predicting. The reaction was not measured. By the close of the following day, Warner's stock had fallen by 1/3. Billions of dollars of belief evaporated in a single trading session. Belief, it turned out, had been most of what they were worth. Then came the human arithmetic. Atari had employed roughly 10,000 people at its peak. Over the next 18 months, it would cut them by the thousands, until only a few hundred remained. One engineer who stayed to the end remembered the company losing about $1 million a day. And in a warehouse in El Paso, Texas, sat the physical residue of the dream. Hundreds of thousands of cartridges no one would buy, built for a market that no longer believed. Couldn't be sold, couldn't be given away. Worthless in the most literal sense the word allows, and they had cost a fortune to make. A company that had spent everything convincing the world its product was the future now had one problem left to solve. How do you make the past disappear?
E.T. the video game. E.T. is definitely here.
You take it out to the desert at night. In September 1983, 14 truckloads of unsellable cartridges left the El Paso warehouse and drove southwest to a landfill outside Alamogordo, New Mexico. About 728,000 cartridges. Not just E.T., but Pac-Man, Centipede, Defender, the games an entire culture had once called the future. They were crushed, buried. And then, when local kids started climbing the fence to dig for them, a layer of concrete was poured over the top to make sure their biggest failure stayed in the ground. Then the company did the last thing a believer does when the belief dies. It denied the whole thing had happened. That is the grave. That is what the man drove into the desert to find 31 years later, with 200 strangers standing around the hole. Not treasure, not a secret. The proof. 728,000 copies of a thing that a company had paid a fortune to create, and then paid a second fortune to erase. Entombed in concrete, because the cheapest thing left to do with the future was to bury it where no one could check. The 4 programmers who'd walked out in 1979 had, by then, been right about everything. The company they left behind was burying games in the desert. The company they built would one day be worth $69 billion. The backhoe broke through. The legend was true. It was always going to be true. The 200 people in the desert told themselves they came for nostalgia. They didn't. They came because some part of them already knew what was down there and needed to see it with their own eyes. Because the grave was never full of cartridges. It was full of the one thing we reach for every time something new and bright steps forward and promises to be the future. The conviction that new and good are the same word. Atari didn't die because it made a bad game. It died the moment it forgot there was a difference between novelty and quality. And so did everyone who handed over the money without checking. The whole market mistook the new for the good, all at once, and buried both in the same hole. We never stopped doing it. We just got better at not looking at the grave. The next one is already in your hands. You bought it because it was new, because it was sold as the future. And you're going to tell yourself it's good. Power isn't built on quality. It's built on novelty. In ruin begins the moment we mistake the new for the good, because by then, we've buried both. Atari was a company that propped itself up on belief of the future. FTX also propped itself up on belief in moral altruism, and committed a $32 billion fraud to do it. FTX is live on the channel. Check it out next.